Thanks everyone for being here today. So I'll be talking about out-of-body experiences, very much in the theme of previous discussions that everyone has heard today, looking at what can the psi component or the veridical component of OBEs tell us about the nature of mind-body integration, mind-body split, as well as potentially verifying that mind can exist without body, which is really the big question in consciousness research at the moment. So I'll talk a bit about my current research in this area as well as where I hope to go next and some of the unanswered questions. So I guess just to start off with, Stephen LaBerge stated that OBEs are one of the most profound experiences we can have. And I think the reason he said that is because a person is literally thrown out of their body, and it can be a very disorienting experience the first time you have one. However, in some ways, this complicates the research because accounts can be embellished in many ways. So the reason I wanted to focus on high-realism perception in OBEs is to look at what do people actually see and to what extent are those perceptions linked to real-world perception. So can we ask someone to go out of body and then recollect particular information around them and bring that information back? Or are they experiences that are really off into another dimension or another dreamlike sort of state? And that makes a big difference in terms of how we conceptualize out-of-body experiences. So the original project was funded by AIPR. I initially started the research. Joyce Bock has come on board with future studies that we'll be doing along these lines. So as I mentioned, I'll talk about what I've done and then future implications of this. So also why it's important to focus on these veridical OBEs rather than just looking at out-of-body experiences more broadly. Because if we include every single description or definition of an out-of-body experience, it becomes too broad and too difficult to manage the data. So we start with the definitional issue. What exactly is an out-of-body experience? And interestingly, we can find really broad definitions in literature, starting from dreamlike states. Some of the neuroscience literature suggested that these are more like hallucination experiences or illusions. Some of the transpersonal literature suggests that they're more mystical or spiritual experiences. So it's such a broad range of definitions when we talk about going out of body or having an out-of-body state. And part of the reason for that is that this is such a broad sort of state that someone can have, and it can occur in a number of different conditions, so spontaneously or induced with meditation or certain types of practice, for instance. So just briefly, problems with the literature in terms of defining OBEs. The neuroscience literature has been way too narrow and has cut out a lot of the definition of what an out-of-body experience involves, focusing instead too much on the autoscopy or the sense of viewing one's body from an external space and then pretty much putting a full stop there and leaving it there. But for those of you that have had an OBE, you know that there's a lot more to the experience than that. On the other hand, a lot of the transpersonal literature has been a bit too broad and too lax with these definitions. And we could almost ask, what isn't an out-of-body experience? It becomes a bit problematic. So really, these definitions are worlds apart. So for my research, I wanted to segment this into two different types of out-of-body experiences. One, looking at realistic, or what we might call veridical OBEs, where a person might be having the sense of floating out of their body upon falling asleep, and they literally see themselves laying in their bed. Everything is exactly the same way as it looks in their room, or very similar at least. So realistic type veridical out-of-body experiences. The other category is, of course, not so physically grounded or not so realistic experiences, where someone might go off and have a dream-like encounter. They might recount going to the moon or to Mars, for instance, going out of body and going to these different planets or different realms. So these I've classified as being different types of OBEs. It's not necessarily this simple in terms of distinguishing between both, which we'll talk about. But for the purposes of this research, I found it important to focus on the first type. So can we actually verify what's gone on in the out-of-body experience. The second type is still really interesting and really important, but I found that there are limitations in how much we can actually do with this from a research standpoint. Still can be very powerful and meaningful experiences to the person, but in terms of, is it verifiable, is it valid? It gets into a bit of dark water with this one. So as I mentioned, the definitions are worlds apart. A classic account of OBE expert Graham Nichols comes to mind. Graham Nichols has had dozens, probably hundreds, of veridical out-of-body experiences where he's visited particular landmarks in the town he lives in, as well as other regions, and can actually come back and recall those landmarks and specific things that were out of order that he hasn't visited in the past or hasn't realized in the past, and he'll go back the next day and find that there's verification of that. As we mentioned, someone can have an OBE and travel to a completely different realm, maybe interact with, I don't know, like a lizard god or something like that. And again, that's very meaningful, but to what extent can we verify or gain some information from that? So again, I found it useful to focus on the veridical aspect of these experiences. Again, as this is a very broad sort of topic to talk about, we can start with the question of, why do we have OBEs, or why is this important to look at? And we can also consider, what is it that gives us that sense of being in the body in the first place? So if we run a number of brain scans, there isn't a particular region in our brain that tells us that we need to stay embodied. The best we know in the scientific literature is that through deep neural networks, we have a continuity of self-embodiment. So we know that we're in our own body and others are in their own body, and that there's a boundary between us. But when someone has an out-of-body experience, those signals begin to break down, and they're able to actually move out of that boundary. But the real question is, to what extent is that a real and verifiable state, and to what extent is that more of a delusional hallucination? And this is really where a lot of the debate lies. So they have very broad implications. This is an image of the galaxies as opposed to synapses and neurons. A colleague of mine actually showed me these images and said, we can see similarities in the patterns between galaxies and synapses connecting neurons. And I think that encapsulates quite well how broad OBEs are. We can literally experience the broadest depths of the mind through an out-of-body experience, but we can also have very concrete, physically grounded experiences as well. I think it's really interesting, Peter, that you raised the physics aspect of this issue as well. And one of the things when I was preparing this presentation that came to mind is the intersect between research in quantum physics and consciousness science. So that intersect is quite slowly converging, but I think it does raise interesting questions about traveling beyond the constraints of the physical world into the universe and into other realms. It kind of brings to mind this image from the film Interstellar that some of you might have seen, where these constraints of time, space begin to be challenged, and the characters in the film actually start approaching the event horizon in a black hole and begin seeing past, present, and future through this sort of fourth, fifth dimensional lens. So I think that there's a lot of potential to out-of-body experiences in that sense of the constraints that we can go past. But we also have to start off with, what is the nature of this experience, and what is the tangible aspects of the OBE. All right, so in terms of giving a bit of research background, historical information, and I'll be talking a bit about why it's important to have controlled out-of-body experience research rather than only relying on case studies. We can start with the 1940s with Penfield's research of electrostimulation. So in his treatment of epileptic patients, Penfield accidentally discovered that you can actually trigger an out-of-body experience by stimulating a particular part of the brain. So in an attempt to actually treat the epileptic symptoms, these people would actually start having OBEs when that region was targeted. More recently, Olaf Blanke has explored this by targeting the temporoparietal junction in the brain, which is well known to maintain our sense of balance. So I mentioned earlier that we tend to take for granted our sense of actually being in a body and being able to get up in the morning and have that sense of continuity that we are our own selves, Blanke found that if we target the temporoparietal junction with electromagnetic stimulation, people begin to lose that sense of embodiment. They no longer distinguish, is this the boundary of my body, or does it extend further into the room and further into extrapersonal space? So that was really interesting in terms of coming to the conclusion that we can induce out-of-body experiences in a laboratory setting. Sometime after Penfield's research, a researcher named Lackner came up with this Pinocchio illusion, which basically suggests that if you get participants to close their eyes, start stroking their nose like this, but then progressively move their elbow outwards, you replace their hand with your own hand and continue stroking their nose, they get a sense that their nose is actually getting longer, progressively getting longer and longer. This opened up a whole can of worms in the research literature, which continued with the rubber hand illusion in the late 1990s, where researchers were able to trick participants into having the sense that a fake hand or a rubber hand is actually their own hand. And continued on into the 2000s. In 2007, Henrik Egersen at Karolinska Institute published the out-of-body illusion experiment. Again, looking at whether we can convince someone that they've had an out-of-body experience or create the illusion that they've had an out-of-body experience. So I think these studies are very interesting in terms of showing we can control the state of someone going into an OBE. They give us a bit more control and a better methodology rather than relying on historical accounts or case studies. But for now, the best we have with out-of-body experiences are case studies. So I'll talk a bit about these and then also how we can improve upon this, building on some of this historical research. So before I get into this research, just one final historical sort of note about why this is really interesting, not only from a psychological perspective, but also in philosophy. So we had some talks about philosophy today, and in particular, this traces back to some of those philosophers like Spinoza, like Descartes, that really raised this issue of the mind-body split problem, which we still, 300-400 years later, still haven't resolved quite. And I think out-of-body experiences really go to the heart of this. If we can know one way or the other what's actually going on, is there a discrete mind-body split happening? All right. And finally, what led me to this direction of looking at veridical or verifiable OBEs is the issue of memory. So we tend to take memory for granted, but it's actually, it's quite a curious thing in terms of how it works. Specifically with OBEs, people tend to remember them fairly clearly, more clearly than regular memories. So if you think about something that happened earlier today, you'll probably recall it a lot more clearly than something that happened last Tuesday or a couple of weeks ago. With OBEs, they tend to be quite vivid and stay in people's memory for a long time. So drawing upon some of the cases that you mentioned, Peter, if we look at Eben Alexander's case of having a complete near-death experience, but then also an OBE of separation from the body and being able to observe what was going on around him, what the nurses were talking about in the operating theatre and still. After coming out of this quite extreme case of NDE, Eben Alexander actually couldn't recall a lot of his own personal memories, yet he could recall characteristics of the observing the operating theatre from above with real clarity, which is quite interesting. So it's a bit of a paradox. Sue Blackmore, likewise a really big skeptic of whether there's anything paranormal at all about OBEs. Yet even in her own most recent book, she states, my memories of that night when she had the out-of-body experience, I think it was in her teens or adolescence, as people say about their memories of NDEs and OBEs, it is as though they seem to have a brightness, an immediacy, and intensity that other memories do not. So in her book, she really does critique this idea that there's anything paranormal about OBEs, yet she keeps getting drawn back to these memories. There's something very clear or profound about them, which is interesting. So this is what I based the hypothesis on. I thought, if people do remember with such clarity what happened in the OBE, we can draw upon this and we can look at, did they recall information that we can verify or that we can kind of cross-check in a way. So starting with the hypothesis, to collect any kind of meaningful data about out-of-body experiences, we need to look at OBEs that corresponded to the real world. So other types of out-of-body experiences are really interesting, but they're not going to give us that really concrete, solid memory data. They might be more like dreamlike or visiting other universes or other worlds. So even focusing only on that small sample of people that have verifiable or veridical OBEs, there's still some problems with this. First of all, out-of-body experiences are not necessarily as clear-cut. They can start off as though you're actually in the same room where you were. Like if you were to have an out-of-body experience now, you might be looking back on the room and everything seems as it was. But then it suddenly starts to transform into some kind of other weird dreamlike environment that's not a reflection of this world. Likewise with the second point, everything can be exactly the same, except one aspect of the room is missing, which suggests that, again, is this kind of like a hallucination or dreamlike experience rather than a state of real mind-body split, if there is such a thing. So are our memories actually just being extenuated? So I think it's fascinating that memories of out-of-body experiences tend to be so real and crystal clear, but there are cases where memory can be very clear but still fallible. For example, flashbulb memories of traumatic events. And likewise, memory is fallible by nature, so to what extent can we validate someone's recollection of an event that might have happened weeks, months, or years ago? However, there is compelling evidence that we should at least evaluate this claim and that we should pursue it. We can think of common examples in the parapsychological literature, accounts of people being able to verify their OBEs. So for instance, Kenneth Ring documented a number of these cases. One of them was not a participant, I think it was an account that was recollected afterwards where the individual floated above, I think it was a hospital bed. They actually continued floating above the hospital and saw the roof of the hospital. They actually saw a shoe on the roof. So they climbed up and had a look, is there actually a shoe there? And there was a shoe on the roof. So accounts like this, there's not enough of them for us to turn around and say that this is solid evidence, but there are a few of them out there which at least raise the question of, we should maybe look a bit more into this. So quite common, this happens in hospital settings when someone is in general anesthesia. They float up and recall what the nurses or doctors were actually talking about while they were in general anesthesia. It happens too often for it to just be a coincidence or some kind of sensory illusion. In other cases that are a bit out of range for this sort of like basic verifiable perception, we have prophetic components, so people actually get information that might relate to the future. So again, I can think about the example of Graham Nichols here, who had an out-of-body experience and saw a bomb blast a few towns away. And coming out of the out-of-body experience, a few hours later, there was actually a bomb blast. So these sort of prophetic information that comes through, a bit more difficult to verify those ones. So Peter, you mentioned Sam Parnier's studies. This is really the most robust study on this sort of phenomena that's come out. Still has a number of issues that could be addressed, so I was glad to hear that he is following up with that. But this demonstrated that in a lot of cases, individuals in the cardiac arrest units could actually perceive information that they shouldn't be able to perceive while in general anesthesia. The burden of proof is quite high around this, though. It's difficult for us to say, if someone perceived a conversation a nurse was having with a doctor, that this is proof of the mind-body split. There are just too many variables that come into this. So someone might have, told them what the nurse was talking about. There's just so much that could go on that would cast doubt on this. So I think that the burden of proof has to be really at a level where someone would be able to maybe access information or read information while out of body, like they attempted to do in Parnier's study, and then bring back that tangible information. So the issue being that anecdotes, telling stories about what someone heard or saw, just doesn't have enough weight to a scientific standard, especially in modern psychology. And of course, some evidence from the contrary side. So the example of Sue Blackmore putting numbers on her fridge and saying, everyone's welcome to have an out-of-body experience or remote viewing session, tell me what the numbers are, and apparently no one could do it. So there's contrary evidence around this as well. All right, so in terms of the study I ran, looking at specifically veridical out-of-body experiences, my intention was to have a think about how people's perception interacts with the world in OBE. So it's easier to work under the presumption that when someone has an out-of-body experience, they perceive things in a very similar way to physical sight, but that might not necessarily be the case. So that was one of the big things to look at. The targeting was entirely through Facebook, just because it's an easy way to connect with people today. People aged 18 to 65, living either in Australia, US, or the UK. I looked at individuals who are already interested in out-of-body experience, working on the logic that they might have had one and they looked up what it is on Facebook or social media. And we reached quite a large number of those people. However, like with any kind of social advertising or anything like this, only about 2,000 of them clicked on the questionnaire, and only a third of them actually did the questionnaire. I don't know why the others clicked, but 626 completed the questionnaire. I looked at the data specifically from those that had allegedly verifiable or veridical OBE, so those were 406, whereas the others said that they had out-of-body experiences, but they weren't correspondent to reality at all. So I developed a basic questionnaire, mostly qualitative, to look at what were people's perceptions like in their OBEs. And I also had a few questions in there about their perceptions, memories, and whether there was any psi component or paranormal component, if you like, going on. Just to break down some of the overall results, I was surprised to find that most of the accounts were spontaneous. So these people weren't expecting to have an out-of-body experience. They might have been going for a jog or falling asleep, and suddenly they found themselves feeling out of body. I was expecting that might be a bit different, since these people were already looking at what is out-of-body experience, that they might be trying to induce one. But still, about 20% of participants claimed they self-induced their experiences, whether through meditation, visualization, or other techniques. And about 55 said they just didn't know how it happened, whether it was spontaneous or induced. It was maybe somewhere in the middle. So that was across the board, despite how many experiences people had. So a lot of the participants had out-of-body experiences pretty frequently, about 3 or 4 times per year, which is pretty impressive. But in terms of the distribution of spontaneous to induced, that was pretty common, despite how frequent the OBEs were. So I'll give some examples of accounts and some of the other themes that I looked at. Some interesting accounts of psi activity going on. So I looked at two dimensions of parapsychological activity. The first one being able to get some information during an out-of-body experience and bring it back and verify it. And the second one being precognition. So we talked about those 2 examples earlier. So I'll give you some examples of each. The first one is gaining some remote information and verifying this in some way. The participant stated, and I haven't corrected these for errors, I should say, because I don't mess with the data, I just leave it as it is. So if it kind of reads a bit strangely, sorry about that. Mum's living room several states away. Never have been there, was able to describe furniture and placement. Nighttime, she was sitting in a chair reading, saw what she wore, called her the next day to verify. Came to a few feet above the bed, floated quickly down. Husband wanted to know why she was up. So one example of verifying information. Again, keep in mind this is an anecdote. It's, we have to kind of go out on a limb and trust that this is the person is telling the truth. They could well be, but again, thinking about that scientific burden of proof. An example of a precognitive out-of-body experience. I saw the death of my great aunt and uncle a few months before they died in the out-of-body experience. So a few examples of those in the data set as well. Some examples that had both perception that was allegedly verified as well as precognitive aspects. So this is just one of those. I was with a specific girl in a jewelry store. When I came out of the OBE, she happened to be the first person I saw when I came out of my hotel room. I was then in a jewelry store with her, just like the one I saw in the OBE. So we see a bit of both going on in this example. Okay, so next I'll talk about some of the common themes that really stood out across all of these accounts. And then I'll give a few more examples of some of the accounts. So it was quite common that people experienced themselves as like a body double when they were out of body. They experienced like a secondary invisible or other body. However, some talked about just being a point of consciousness. So no sense of secondary body at all. It was like just a very fixed point of consciousness left the physical body. Interestingly, the word consciousness was used quite often in accounts, more so than talking about myself. So people didn't really say my sense of self left my body. They tended to write my consciousness felt like it left my body, which was interesting. And many participants talked about clearly perceiving their own body, so their own physical body laying back in bed or sitting or wherever it was, as well as anyone that was around them, such as their partner's body, for instance. And as expected, many accounts did have some kind of transpersonal or transcendental aspect to them, even if they were purely grounded in physical reality. So participants still reported a sense of elation or positivity around the experiences. There weren't really any accounts that, there were a couple that was scary or negative, but most of them had a positive aspect when talking about a transpersonal component. Just a few other things to note. So about 406 participants claimed that they had verifiable perception in OBE. After actually manually going through the accounts, just over half of those actually corresponded to their physical surroundings. So obviously there was a bit of discrepancy between self-report and what was actually going on. Some participants reported an exact replica of their physical environment with a slight change. One example of that could be seeing their room exactly as it was, but everything was blue or everything was orange. They might have seen things exactly as they were, but their bookshelf wasn't where it was supposed to be, or the door handle was missing, or slight inaccuracies in their perception like this. Around 33 accounts described a component of their physical perception was not related to the physical world. So again, there was a bit of like a dreamlike state. 9% of people talked about a sense of floating. So not all people experience a progressive floating. Some of them may find themselves out of body spontaneously with no progression at all. But some participants definitely did talk about a progressive sense of actually floating up and out of the body. All right, and some final more minor themes. So some of these just barely classify as themes because there were only maybe 5 or 6 people that reported them, but it was still interesting to find that common thread across some of the accounts. So in terms of something paranormal or psi-like going on, 4% of the participants reported that they had some kind of remote perception that they could verify. Only about 2% reported precognitive or prophetic aspect. A few people talked about having a 360 view, so it wasn't like their perception was in front of them, but it was actually all around them instead. Some spoke about a sense of being in the same place, but not quite in the same time. So they were in their room, but it was in the past or in the future instead. In terms of where they had their out-of-body experience, most had it while lying in bed, which I guess we could kind of anticipate if people do experience OBEs when they're in a relaxed state. However, some of them had really interesting sort of circumstances that brought about the OBE as well. So, for example, while walking, not one I expected, during meditation, resting on the couch, while in hospital, while sitting or laying on the floor, while in the bathroom or bath, while driving, one account or a few accounts, and some in the kitchen. In terms of how people induced their experiences if they were self-induced, 43 people, around 10-11%, did this through relaxation or meditation techniques. Some people use specialized techniques, which is basically a term that I use to describe when they talked about, I used this author's technique or I used this method. I kind of put them under specialized techniques that they read or applied. 12 people through breathing techniques, 6 through visualization, 5 through using some kind of musical aid, and 4 that were substance induced. All right, so a few other examples, and I've picked out examples that are not necessarily extraordinary or mind-blowing, and to demonstrate that this is reasonably common occurrence. So OBEs do happen in about 10 to 20% of the population, and many people don't know that. They think that it's such a rare phenomena. But one of the reasons I actually started off studying OBEs and doing my PhD on this is because it is fairly more common than we'd think it is, and there is data out there that we can study. All right, so one example, this person was traveling on an overnight train between Greece and Turkey in 1987. In a cabin by myself sleeping on the bunk, I was suddenly awakened and felt myself floating out of body. I could clearly see my surroundings from the light shining in through the cabin window, from the buildings and roads along the railway line. It felt as if I was floating in the air and I could see 2 bodies, my real body below me sleeping, and another body floating in the air above my real body. So I almost see 3 different points here, the 2 bodies and the point of perception. Another example, so this one has a bit of a twist to it, which is interesting. I was looking down at my body sleeping. I could see the room completely the same as how I had fallen asleep. I could smell food smells from the kitchen, hear people in the house talking, and feel the breeze from the nearby window. I would see people in the room with me. Most of the time they were trying to convey messages. At those times the scenery would change and I would go where they would take me. Sometimes these would be places in other time periods, modern or circa 1800s, and sometimes I'd be in the middle of nowhere or in a war-torn country. Each experience would tell a different story. Usually no words were exchanged. So we can see it starting off in a pretty regular way, but then some changes occur with going between past and future, and also some interactions that the person had with other beings. And finally, I was taking a Saturday afternoon nap, and I was dropping off to sleep when I heard a loud buzzing noise that filled the room. As the buzzing noise receded, I thought I was awake, and so I sat up. As I did so, I happened to look back towards my pillow, and I saw my own body laying there. I was amazed at how old I really looked. The room surroundings were identical, but the only thing that was off was the coloration of my clothing and the bed linens. I got to my feet and went to the living room, and it looked virtually the same, except there seemed to be a window in one of the walls that doesn't exist in reality. So again, we can see a fairly typical experience, but then there are these unexpected changes in perception that arise. So just to begin to close off, and then I'll take some questions as well. So in terms of, did this actually work by restricting the definition of out-of-body experience? I think it did, in the sense that the data was useful to look at. We could filter out a lot of the accounts that other directories that record out-of-body experiences have the issue with. So a lot of data sets have these embellished accounts, or accounts that don't actually talk about any grounded perception in physical reality that could be avoided with this research. The other benefit is coming up with a more clear-cut definition of the out-of-body experience. Like, what is it actually? Is it about perceiving things out of one's physical body around them, or does it encompass any kind of state that doesn't have bodily grounding? Which I think the latter is a bit too broad, and we do need to come up with a more concise definition, but also not too narrow like the neuroscientists have done with this one. I think it also helps really segment other accounts that are not OBE in their rightful place. So for example, journeys with entheogens or substance use like someone mentioned ketamine and LSD can cause very similar experiences, but are they OBEs or are they something else? Perceptual distortions, hallucinations. So again, I think it's important to really come up with a clear-cut definition and to separate this from other accounts. But perhaps most importantly, it provides a bit of a framework for evaluating OBEs in the future and looking at whether we can validate some of the impressions and perceptions that people have had. So something to keep in mind, parapsychology is still somewhat of a minor and fringe field in psychology overall. This gives you a bit of a demonstration that there are a lot of papers published in psychology overall every year. Transpersonal and parapsychology are two very small areas in that. So naturally, the definitions we see translate into journals, into textbooks, are those dominated by more of the major fields like neuroscience and perception, rather than definitions that do accommodate for perhaps some of the psi aspects of out-of-body experience. So that's something to keep in mind, that that's not necessarily going to change overnight. But by continuing to do this research, we can look at carving out definitions that do include a parapsychology component, but we have to be careful to not include everything in those definitions that might look or sound like an OBE, and also be quite stringent and rigorous with that. So I think where the solution may lay is looking at personal accounts of OBE, but also how these relates to other people's perceptions. So is it simply that the person had an out-of-body experience and then came back and said it was so real, I've got proof of life after death, I've got proof that I saw everything around me? Or does there need to be some kind of validation from others, whether that's, it doesn't have to be scientists, but whether that's someone close to the person, that they can actually say, let's check this out, what did you see, and can we verify this in some way? And I think the answer to that question is yes, there has to be a bit of an intersect between the personal perception of OBEs and also how others relate to those experiences. If that intersect isn't there, then we run the risk of overemphasizing personal accounts. So a person might write a book about the account or talk to others about it, but there's no real basis to validate that. Or it can fall into more of the transpersonal dimension of personal integration, that the OBE was very meaningful and transformative for them. And it doesn't necessarily need to have a verifiable component in that case, because that's enough for that transformation to occur. But if we want to get to the actual verification, that's where we need cross-verification with others. First, we have to examine what is the perspective that others have. If they're starting off with the perspective that it was some kind of hallucination or something like that, it's probably not going to be very helpful to seek verification from them in the first place. But if they're open-minded and they're not biased, then I think that this is a good sort of exchange to work from in terms of validating any of those accounts. And a lot of the accounts were quite interesting. The issue, as I mentioned, is that they are based on past anecdotes. So some of these experiences people had 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we did try and reach out to them and get more data from them, because some of the accounts were vague, but they seemed to really be onto something. But the issue was the accounts are quite old. They're also quite difficult to validate because they are based on self-accounts. But in particular, I found an overlap in about 32 of the participants that was really interesting. And those were participants that, first of all, reported very frequent OBEs that happened 3-4 times a year or more, that they could induce them willfully, which is always a bonus if we can have people actually induce an out-of-body experience rather than waiting for it to happen automatically. And that had some kind of psi component, so whether that's precognition or remote validation of information. Unfortunately, that number was quite low, and it was difficult to get in contact with those participants. So this is one potential future research approach, to look at individuals who do have allegedly verifiable OBEs, which is a very small proportion, that also have these quite frequently and that can induce the experiences themselves. Two other approaches that I'm exploring as part of current research is actually inducing OBEs within some kind of laboratory setting. One approach is via hypnosis. So this is quite a promising model. If someone is not going to have an OBE spontaneously, can we create a hypnotic trance where they're encouraged to exit the body? The research suggests, yes, that it's quite promising for us to be able to do this, as long as people meet the threshold of being hypnotizable. So one potential approach, getting people into the laboratory, hypnotize them, have an out-of-body experience, recollect some information that they couldn't know otherwise, and then tell us what that information is. The other route to take with this is following on from the literature I mentioned earlier on, looking at disrupting neural and perceptual functioning. So technology is quite advanced now that we don't have to electroshock particular parts of the brain. We can induce out-of-body states using specific illusions or even virtual reality type simulation where someone perceives themselves floating above the body. So two potential approaches for further research that could make this research a bit more controlled rather than relying on anecdotes. All right, so I'll just leave off with a quote from the other side of things. So I talked a lot about the verifiable nature of physically grounded OBEs, and sometimes I can come across as though I'm saying that this is the only important component of the research. I only say that is because I am a scientist and I like to be quite precise, but I think there is a really broad world of experience beyond this as well. And this is summed up quite well by mystic and author Jürgen Ziwi. He states his opinion on the out-of-body experience. It's quite a unique one. It appears that when consciousness is released from its tether to its exclusive physical focus, it enters what he calls its home territory of non-physicality, where it can broaden and accentuate its self-awareness into new frontiers. That which consciousness then experiences in its home world are the infinite and myriad things that can be perceived, encountered, processed, imagined, fantasized about, and projected into a reinterpretation in waking life. In addition to all the former unseen subconscious elements, which are no longer subconscious, but rather an open book for the experiencer not to just see, but wander through an experience. So his perspective is that the OB is like a really broad thing that we can't take lightly. So I do just want to emphasize that as well, that what I've spoken about is one very controlled aspect of that, but there is a much broader component to OBEs. Thanks so much for listening.